So in this seminar, we will aim to introduce the guidelines for parliamentary libraries and try and demonstrate how to use them to develop services based on the needs of customers. By the end of the session, you should understand the importance of identifying MPs' information needs, be aware of some of the ways that parliamentary libraries can meet MPs' needs, and be able to use the guidelines for parliamentary libraries to help build services. Most of the themes covered in this session are covered in greater depth in the guidelines, and at various points I'll be referring to which place in the guidelines you should look for more information. Okay, start with a picture which I selected initially because it's a beautiful representation of one of the classic layouts for a parliamentary chamber, Westminster style of two opposing benches, as opposed to the hemicircle, which many congresses and parliaments have. But on reading about the Kenyan parliament, I was sad and shocked to learn that in June of this year, the parliament was stormed by protesters. According to Wikipedia, several rooms were ransacked while parts of the buildings were set on fire. The ceremonial mace used in legislative proceedings was stolen. 10 protesters tragically were shot dead by police, with 31 protesters injured and over 280 protesters arrested. This is a reminder that the work of parliaments is frequently controversial, and their decisions are often vitally important. In this case, the protesters were protesting about financial measures that have been passed by the parliament. So this, for me, demonstrates very clearly why the work that you do in supporting MPs to make their decisions is such a crucial role and such an important responsibility. But also a fantastic honor as well, I think. Okay. We're going to start with a chance for you to vote. We'll have a poll. It's a multi-choice poll, and we're asking what information services are made available for members of parliament or members of Congress in your country. You can choose as many as apply. Hard copy information resources, digital information resources, bespoke research on demand, or published briefings on legislation, hot topics, etc. And also any other services that are available. You can tick the other box in the poll. And if you want to, if there's anything else that you do that you'd like to share, then you can put that in the chat, and then we'll talk about the results afterwards. Now, in this poll, we're not looking for all the other sources of information that MPs have access to that aren't provided by the parliamentary administration. So, for example, we're not thinking about MPs' own research. We're not thinking about information that may have been provided by lobbyists and by party sources. Right, I see everyone is voting enthusiastically. I think voting may have finished. Nearly. Okay, so let's share the results. So we can see, this is no surprise, I think, won't be a surprise to any of you, that the most common information resource is digital resources. 93% selected that. And in second place, it's a tie between hard copy resources, bespoke research, and published briefings. So that's really interesting that such a high proportion of people here come from parliaments where bespoke research is made available to the members, and also published briefings. Really good to see that. And yes, 36% provided other resources as well. So like I say, if you'd like to put anything in the chat about what other resources you provide, then feel free to do that. Okay, thank you. Let's move on. So let's think quickly about how parliaments work. Is Parliament a forum for reasoned debate and careful deliberation, as we see in this picture here? Or is it, in fact, something more like a sausage machine, with voting determined mainly by orders from the party? Well, it's important to understand that parliaments work through the actions of MPs. They may act individually or collectively. They can make speeches, ask questions, etc. They can take part in committees. They can take part in the work of party blocks and so forth. Voting, I think this is the essence of it. Voting expresses the collective will of Parliament. So the act of voting is always, in theory, an individual choice. How much freedom MPs have in practice is a very complicated story, I guess, and will depend on many factors. But anyway, given that, at least in theory, then MPs have an individual choice in how to vote, then it's clear that to operate effectively, parliaments need to help MPs to work well. This depends on them having good information, amongst other things. So this and several of the following slides are covered in Chapter 3 of the guidelines. Right, just noticed that Joanna has posted in the other category direct support of a research analyst for committees and associations, as well as support for speakers with diplomacy work. That's interesting, and I think many people will recognize both of those. Where I used to work, the House of Commons Library was unusual in that we did very little direct work for the speaker. I did some work with the Ukrainian Parliament recently, and the speaker was their most popular customer. So there's a huge variation there between different parliaments. Okay, let's move on. So the question here is how to support the information needs of members of Parliament. And the MP shown here is an English MP, Ed Davey, the leader of the Lib Dem party. He is making a speech in the chamber, and it's entirely possible that he asked the House of Commons Library for a brief to help him write the speech. But we need to remember all the time that information needs for MPs are highly specific. The information must be tailored to the role or task it's needed for. If he was speaking instead to a group of local school children or to a local business, it's very likely that a lot of the information in the parliamentary brief would have not have been relevant, and they would have needed information tailored much more to their situation and their level of understanding and the level of detail they need. Okay, so MPs have multiple roles which may overlap or be in conflict. The anthropologist Emma Crew has described them as shape-shifting to negotiate complex hierarchies and roles. This doesn't mean that MPs are by nature dishonest. I think that's a very unfair characterization. But individuals who are not adept at operating in a range of different situations will often struggle to meet all of the demands on them. Of course, we can help members of Parliament to perform roles that they're not so expert in. We can lend them our expertise, our knowledge, to help them perform in those different roles. And I'll note also that tasks can be parliamentary or extra-parliamentary. So for example, party or constituency oriented. But in practice, these often overlap too. So concerns that are raised in the constituency are often brought back into the chamber as part of the debate, for example. So moving on to the roles carried out by MPs, these can be, in some parliaments, the role of minister or of the opposition spokesperson. It can be of a backbench MP with no particular other responsibilities in mind. It can be that of a committee member or a constituency representative and so forth. And then moving on to tasks carried out by MPs. So in lots of the roles I described just now, there can be many different tasks, and these are some of them. So it might include scrutiny of legislation, asking questions of ministers, making speeches, media appearances, and so forth. This picture here is of Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister of Denmark. Okay, so how do MPs interpret their roles and tasks? This can be based on career, it may be based on policy interest, or it may be based on external pressure. And these can often pull MPs in radically different directions. We'll come back to that in a little while. And moving on now, I also want to stress the importance of local considerations. Most of the roles and tasks described here will be familiar in most parliaments, but the local aspects are vitally important. How, for example, is a particular task configured? How does a particular procedure work locally? What roles and tasks are seen as most important locally? As an example, in many parliaments, MPs have the ability to publish draft laws, often referred to as bills. In some circumstances, they may be able to pilot their bill through the various stages of scrutiny to become law. In the Ukrainian parliament, or Verona Rada, MPs publish thousands of draft laws every year, very few of which, if any, can become law. Draft bills are a way of expressing support for a particular initiative or policy position. But a great deal of the capacity of the parliamentary administration in Ukraine is devoted to analysing these draft laws from a procedural perspective. So any attempt to plan services which didn't take account of that need would be flawed. Okay, time for another poll. So here we're asking, what do MPs in your country think is their most important task? This could be introducing or scrutinizing legislation, could be asking debate questions of ministers, taking part in plenary debates, taking part in committee meetings, having meetings with stakeholders such as interest groups, making media appearances, or other tasks not included here. And again, if there's something else that you think is important in your country, please feel free to add it in the chat. Okay, also rapid voting here. And the voting is going very quickly. And Ellie has pointed out that constituency casework is another area of activity for MPs, absolutely. And that will come up in the third and final poll in a minute, and we may have a discussion about that. Okay, I think the voting has slowed down. Let's share the results. Sorry if you were just about to ask a question. So, introducing or scrutinizing legislation, it's no surprise perhaps that that has come out on top. And second place, committee meetings, again, perhaps not a surprise. And then also asking questions of ministers, taking part in plenary debates. But then interestingly, meetings with stakeholders came out slightly above plenary debates. Now, I'm sure many MPs do regard their meetings with interest groups as really a vital part of the work they do. And then in last place, making media appearances. Probably most MPs would say, yes, that's not the most important thing I do, but actually they would regard it as very important nonetheless, because of the importance of making the argument for what they do, what they're getting involved in. Okay, thank you. That was very instructive. Let's move on. So it's really important to recognize that MPs are always under pressure. And one way they're under pressure is pressure of time. They almost always have more work than they can fit into 24 hours. Stakeholders expect an instant response. And in the time that I've worked in Parliament, the speed of the news cycle has gone up and up and up, from the introduction of 24-hour news channels on television, on radio, and then through the introduction of social media. So much pressure coming from the need to respond quickly. And then the other main form of pressure that I think of is political pressure, which comes from competing loyalties. So is it the need to vote with the party? Is it the need to take account of national public opinion, interest groups, constituency views, media, and so forth? And maybe last, but hopefully not least, their own political beliefs, the principles that brought them into politics in the first place. To give an example of how these can play out, in October in the UK, the new government announced its financial plans in a statement known as the budget. It was a very complicated set of announcements involving approximately £70 billion, that's about $90 billion of new spending commitments, and $50 billion of tax increases, largely paid for by businesses. Some of these tax changes were and still are very controversial. When MPs were trying to digest and debate the impact of the budget, all of the pressures above were relevant. And for some MPs, these influences would have been pulling in different directions. So, for example, the death tax on agricultural property was introduced for the first time. Previously, families had been able to pass down farms from one generation to the next without any kind of tax liability when the previous owner died. But for the highest value farms, then taxes are now being introduced. These have been very controversial. There's been much lobbying, and MPs have sometimes felt, well, this is for the good of the country. We need to protect public services, but equally we need to protect a way of life. So how are their loyalties going to be displayed? The House of Commons Library produced briefings covering the budget announcements and reactions to them. This is a great example of how accurate, impartial information can help MPs to navigate their delicate balancing act. Again, going back to that death tax measure, some of the headlines were very inaccurate and didn't make it clear that the very smallest farms wouldn't be affected at all by any of these changes. Okay, so moving on now. How can parliamentary libraries help with MPs' information needs? Well, over the years, we built up a deep understanding of MPs' roles and of parliamentary processes. We have a deep understanding of how these can be supported with information, thanks to our professional knowledge as well as our experience. We make a point of providing impartial, accurate, timely and relevant information. And in the information we're providing, we're reflecting the various viewpoints that MPs need to take account of, reflected in the slide earlier about conflicting loyalties. And over time, we become a trusted source of information. Chapter 4 of the guidelines gives an overview of the main services usually provided by parliamentary libraries. Subsequent chapters go into more detail on different services. So it's time for the third and final vote. And in this poll, I'm going to be asking, are there any information needs that parliamentary libraries should not cater for? You can choose as many as you want from this list. There are no right and wrong answers. So the suggestions I've made here are writing speeches. Should we not provide support for writing speeches? Should we not provide background research for speech outside Parliament? Background research for a book or article? Actually writing a book or article on behalf of an MP? Constituency casework? Preparing for media appearance? And research for ministers. So factors which are relevant to which services to provide might include the local political culture or constitution, legislation, for example, freedom of information laws may make it difficult to provide a completely confidential service. Does the demand on the service exceed the capacity to deliver? Would it be particularly inefficient to provide support on some areas of MP's activities? And is support available from other sources, therefore making it perhaps not the best use of precious resources to provide support in that area? Okay, so like I said, there are no right or wrong answers, and you can add as many, you can put as many as you like here. What if your answer to poll 3 is none of the above? Well, absolutely. This is entirely a local policy decision. It might be a pragmatic decision. It might be a principled policy decision. In the last, in the seminar earlier this morning, one participant raised that constituency casework isn't done in their parliament. Ellie mentioned it as an area where some parliamentary libraries do provide support. And in the UK, the House of Commons Library, it's one of the most popular and called upon services that we provide. So no right or wrong answers here. So let's see, how are we doing? Still some votes coming in. Right, I think we've finished. Can we share the results?
It looks like they're up.
Okay, oh, sorry, good. Right, so the thing that was chosen most frequently is writing a book or article. I would agree with that. I would say it's not right for a member of the Parliamentary Administration to write an article, let alone a book, on behalf of an MP. We could argue about whether it's right to provide background research. Often we're in the best position to do that, but then if the research goes on for days and days and days, I would say, is that the best use of precious resources? So the next most common was writing speeches. I would certainly agree that we shouldn't write speeches directly on people's behalf. I would say that providing some background information for writing a speech is a useful service. But the purpose of doing this is to remind everyone that local context is important. There may be certain things that are regarded as absolutely essential in your country. It may be that if you're just starting out, then you have to prioritize and work on some areas, but not on others. The range of activities that can be supported can be expanded over time, particularly if there is support from MPs for this. Okay, thank you. That was really interesting. Let's move on. So, thinking now about tailoring the information to the role or task, something which I mentioned earlier. Chapter 5 of the IFLA Guidelines covers how to select information to meet a need. And the questions you might ask are, is the MP already an expert on this issue? Does she want to read around the subject or get answers to very specific questions? Does she want a range of views to be provided, or does she just want to understand what the line in her party is? Although we provide impartial information, I think it's quite okay if someone asks a factual question. What does this party believe? It could be the MP's party, it could be another party. I think that's absolutely fine without breaching our rules on impartiality. Are they motivated by personal interest, political interest, or are they responding to stakeholder pressure? And do they need information about the process or the issue? For example, they might be interested in the mechanics of a particular vote on a particular issue. So really important to dig a bit deeper and understand why they're asking about a subject. And then having garnered this information, we can decide what type of information will be most useful. Is it a news or journal article? Is it official material, such as a government green paper? Is it bespoke research? Or is it a selection of different sources and types? It may well be that there's more than one type of information which will be useful. On the other hand, if they want the information very quickly, maybe all you can do is to provide very basic material for them. Okay, so to conclude, let's look at planning parliamentary library services. Hopefully the information that we've discussed before now in the seminar has been useful in starting to think about how to plan for developing the service or indeed introducing a new service. My main suggestion for you here is that always talk to MPs at some stage in the process. If you've worked in Parliament for a long time, you may think, don't we already know what they need? I was recently working with Anthony Teasdale, the former head of the European Parliamentary Research Service, and his view was that he would be surprised if we introduced a survey for MPs and they told him something very surprising that he wasn't already aware of. It's also worth bearing in mind that MPs can get quite resentful about being asked questions all the time, being sent endless surveys. So we have to be very judicious in the way that we ask questions. However, it's especially important to talk to MPs if you're starting a new service or planning significant new developments. As we saw in the poll, MPs may interpret their roles differently, and it's important to understand what they view as important. Things that we think may be important, or an academic constitutional theorist may think are important, maybe not what MPs value. And even for those of us who've worked in Parliament a long time, MPs' needs change. They change with the political situation, they change with the development of new media. So it's really important to understand how MPs' needs change as a result of those pressures. So I would say we do need to talk to MPs. We have to be sensitive about how we do it. We have to find ways of doing it and times to do it that suit them. But I would say it's really important. So finally, Chapter 18 of the guidelines discusses some of the main global trends affecting parliamentary libraries, which can be really useful if you're starting to think about introducing a new service or developing your service. And then Chapter 10 goes into detail on how to engage with customers. Now, the steps suggested here are not compulsory. You may choose to do them in a different order, but they can be very useful in planning for creating a new service. So starting with some initial strategic questions. Are we looking to support MP staff as well as the MPs themselves? What are the limits to the service which can be provided? What are the practical limitations? For example, space. We would like to get usually a space close to the chamber if we can, but that may not be possible, or a space close to MPs' offices, but again, that may not be possible. There may be budgetary limitations. And then there may be some crucial issues to address, such as impartiality and trust. So in some parliaments, the services of the parliamentary administration may not be trusted at first because of political history in that country, or because MPs aren't used to the administration providing a service for them. And it's necessary to work closely and build trust in those circumstances. Secondly, find out as much as you can about what MPs' working lives are like. So quality of qualitative and quantitative information can be useful here. So surveys and semi-structured interviews. If you can, get permission to hang around where MPs congregate and interrupt people and ask them questions. MPs often love to talk about what they do if they're not busy, but they can quite often, you can surprise you by making time to speak to you. It can be really hard to reach MPs through email. So persisting is really important. Try again, follow up your email, try and contact their staff if you can. If the MP doesn't respond, try and hang out where they hang out. So use this information when you've gathered it to identify their information needs. And then at this point, you might want to revisit some of the strategic assumptions you made at the beginning of the process, depending on what the research has revealed. You may have discovered that what MPs think they need can be very different to what your initial assumptions were. Then once you've developed your hypothesis about what service to provide, it can be a good idea to talk to MPs again at that point and their staff, and perhaps from there go on to develop detailed proposals. It's often really good to start small and build on existing capacity or services where possible. If you go away for several years and plan a big new service, it can be risky because it may not have quite got it right when it's first introduced, and then the confidence in the service may not be able to be generated. Do look at the guidelines for parliamentary libraries. Do talk to members of the IFLA committee. Do talk to colleagues in other countries if you have any contacts. And don't be afraid to borrow people's ideas, because we're a small community. I can see Ellie smiling. That's what we do. If a good idea comes up, it's a shame not to share it and not to take advantage of it. Okay, so in conclusion, we've looked at how parliaments work through their members. We've seen that members play a number of different roles. We've seen that tailored role-specific information helps parliaments to work better. We've seen that the contribution of a professional, well-resourced parliamentary library is recognized across the globe. It really is. There is a great deal of best practice and support to draw on. Please draw on the support of your colleagues in other countries, and they will be really only too happy to help you. But also, we've seen that local factors such as political culture and local procedures are vitally important too. So what happens in the USA, what happens in Argentina, what happens in Nigeria may not be relevant for you. Even if successful services have been provided there, it may not be exactly the right model for you. Look around and find a country where there are some useful examples for you to borrow. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll hand back to Martin. Oh, and I should say, if you have any questions for me specifically, and there isn't a chance to ask them now, please do get in touch. My email is here. I'll be only happy to respond. Only too happy to respond.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Edward. That was a really great overview of how to go about things, how to go about developing services. And we'll turn now to our panelists, Ellie Valentine, Joanna Smith, and Alejandro Santa. Alejandro will be speaking in Spanish, so when we come to Alejandro, please use the translation option on the bottom of the screen if you want to. I'll turn first to Ellie, because I know you've had experience in a number of countries around the world. So the point that Edward was making there about local conditions and how things vary, I think is probably quite relevant to your experience. How would you? What sort of things that would you like to pick up from what Edward's been talking about?
Well, first of all, I really want to express my thanks to Edward for giving such a concise presentation of really a very complex resource. Are you hearing me?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ellie.
Okay. To emphasize your point that MPs needs change. I think just the fact that this is the third edition of the resource is really a testimony to the work that has been done by the section to develop this resource, to update it, and to make sure that we are meeting the needs of the current contingencies of parliamentary libraries and research services. I also wanted to address Liana's question in the chat, which I think is really important. And I think, Liana, that your question was, can we really deny services to MPs if that's what they're asking for? And I think one of the ways to protect yourself, protect the service, is to make it very clear, to have a very open and transparent policy where you state, what are the limitations of our service? And then they may be limitations because of budget and staff capacity, they very objective reasons. But if it's upfront that these are our limitations for everyone, then denying to provide a service for an individual MP shows that you're not denying that individual MP, but that just generally your service has to prioritize what you're doing, and therefore you're unable to answer that specific request for service. But I think making sure that you have a published, transparent policy that states what the limitations are, and that can be protective. And then another point that I wanted to make on developing what those policy priorities might be is taking stock of the environment. Right now, a lot of the MPs are born digital. So that their needs are going to be very different than, let's say, an MP who has been serving for the last 30 years and has a different requirement. But also in the countries where I've worked, and just for those who may not know, most of my career has been spent working on U.S. Agency for International Development funded parliamentary development projects, and that includes specifically Ukraine, Armenia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and in the period from 1994 until about 2014. And it has been my observation that it also, you need to understand the role that civil society also plays, whether that's think tanks or advocacy groups. How are they reaching Parliament, and how is your service providing a value added for the MPs, whether it's to synthesize information that may be coming from different sources. In countries where I've worked, there's often been a very obvious presence of international development projects. There was a lot of, for example, in Ukraine, there was a lot of reforms that was going on from the early 1990s, through to today, quite frankly. And there was a lot of input from international development projects, and they would provide, but they were mostly providing to the executive. And so what we were trying to do was to encourage the Parliament also to be a recipient of those research papers that might be developed in support of reform efforts, so that so that the MPs were aware of what are the pros and cons. So there can be a very broad role for the parliamentary service to identify sources of information and to help MPs to sort through and synthesize the information that's coming from them. I think also, you know, an expanded service, and I loved the checklist that you went through, Edward, because I think that really reflects our communities, the Parliamentary Library and Research Service communities, the various steps that can help to create support for the library service if there's a resistance from the administration, or if there's a lack of understanding from the administration or the leadership of why do we need this service at all? After all, I can get everything I need from the internet. I can get everything I need from special interest groups. Why do we need this service? And I think that the Guide to Parliamentary Libraries helps us to be able to advocate for why those services are important, and to show that there is this global perspective on information services support to democratic representative institutions. So I think those are some of the initial thoughts that I have based on your presentation, Edward, and the work that the section has done to create this edition of the guidelines.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ellie. And really good to hear about some of your experiences there. If I can turn now to Alejandro, and what are your reflections from the perspective of Argentina?
Bueno, antes que nada, agradecerles a todos a esta reunión. Yo pertenezco a una región que no siempre es tenida en cuenta, la región de América Latina y del Caribe, así que agradezco mucho. Y agradezco también que permitan que la sección sea en español, porque de esta manera es más inclusiva, nos permite que más gente de nuestra región participe. Voy a hablarles básicamente de mi biblioteca, de nuestra biblioteca, la Biblioteca del Congreso de la Nación Argentina. Nuestra biblioteca nace como biblioteca hace 168 años, en 1856, como biblioteca parlamentaria. Y fue la primera biblioteca en nuestra región, en toda la región de América, que abrió al público. Hace 107 años que abrió al público. Y si me permiten, me gustaría dejar como una reflexión importante. Las bibliotecas parlamentarias tenemos que tender a ser públicas. Es fundamental que las bibliotecas parlamentarias, por la importancia que tienen, por la cercanía de quienes deciden sobre la vida de los ciudadanos, tengan un servicio al público. Por dos razones fundamentales. La primera es la visibilización del trabajo parlamentario, para que realmente la sociedad sepa y vea de qué manera se trabaja en el Parlamento. Y la segunda, que es muy importante, nos permite a los bibliotecarios conocer de primera mano qué está pasando en la sociedad, qué es lo que los ciudadanos de nuestra sociedad están necesitando. Y eso es escuchar qué es lo que está pasando en la sociedad y podemos transmitirlo directamente a los legisladores. Lo que hoy está muy de moda junto con la inteligencia artificial, que es la política de anticipación. La política de anticipación no es más ni menos que escuchar y anticiparnos a lo que las sociedades están solicitando. Yo agradezco mucho la resolución de Edward y la de Ellie. Creo que han dado la tecla en función de los que hoy los legisladores son nativos digitales, es cierto, pero quiero decir también que la tecnología no es una amenaza para nosotros, para las bibliotecas parlamentarias, sino es una gran aliada. ¿Y por qué digo esto? Porque estoy convencido que si lo tomamos como una herramienta, y si logramos entrar a los celulares de los legisladores, esto nos va a permitir que ellos, cuando piensen en una validación de la información, piensen en nosotros. Porque el futuro de las bibliotecas va a estar basado en que vamos a ser los únicos con el prestigio para validar la información. No tengo dudas de esto. Y además, entender que la inteligencia artificial no es más que un gran Google, no es más que una gran fuente de información que el humano ha producido y que hoy la tomamos. Nunca un referencista puede ser cambiado por una inteligencia artificial. Nunca un referencista formado y capacitado va a ser sustituido, porque particularmente en estos tiempos donde los legisladores se basan en el copia y pegue en algunos proyectos, está en la formación del referencista para ponerle a esa información el criterio y hasta también, ¿por qué no?, la emocionalidad, el sentir de lo que pasa. Cuando uno es legislador y hace una ley, siempre se habla del espíritu del legislador. Y creo que cuál era la idea y el concepto para llegar a una legislación. Y creo que eso es particularmente irreemplazable. Creo que también es muy importante trabajar en red. Yo también soy parte de una región donde tenemos una red de bibliotecas parlamentarias, hoy compuesta por 20 países, la red de bibliotecas parlamentarias de América Latina y el Caribe. ¿Y qué nos permite esto? Nos permite que de México a Argentina, pasando por el Caribe, cuando tenemos una duda en alguna información, antes era un préstamo interbibliotecario, antes era una cantidad de pasos burocráticos para tener la información. Hoy directamente por WhatsApp podemos comunicarnos con cualquiera de nuestros miembros y saber de qué manera, porque los problemas en todos los países del mundo, en todos los continentes, en todas las regiones, son exactamente los mismos. La diferencia está de qué manera los resolvemos. Entonces, al conocer en primera mano cómo los resolvió otro colega, nos allana un camino. Y esta red, que para mí es fundamental trabajar en ella, y que crezca y siga creciendo, es el futuro, porque las redes van a ser el futuro de nuestras bibliotecas, van a fortalecer. Y de paso les doy una primicia. El Parlamento argentino acaba de aprobar esta semana un proyecto de ley que se va a convertir en ley los próximos días, creando por ley la red de bibliotecas parlamentarias de nuestro país. Quien conoce Argentina sabe que es el octavo país del mundo en dimensiones y tiene 22 distritos diferentes. Estos distritos van a estar todos relacionados a las parlamentarias, los estados provinciales, a través de una red de bibliotecas parlamentarias. Y para finalizar, lo que quiero señalar y volver a repetir, que es fundamental, y a lo mejor me escucharán decirlo muchas veces, la atención al público. Las bibliotecas parlamentarias tenemos que abrirnos al público, no solamente a los legisladores, porque eso nos va a permitir permanecer en el tiempo, nos va a permitir la validación de la sociedad a nuestro trabajo y más que nada la transparencia. La transparencia que debe ser nuestra herramienta de guía. La gente debe conocer de primera mano qué es lo que hacemos. Y también, al tener esa visibilización, el legislador va a poder utilizar los servicios de la biblioteca de los congresos en beneficio de la comunidad. Y no solo en la creación de leyes, sino también para estar al lado de la gente, para estar cercano a la gente. Nosotros tenemos en nuestra biblioteca un bibliomóvil un micro de 2 pisos que lleva más de 5.000 libros y también da un servicio de internet, y ya recorrió nada más ni nada menos que 520.000 kilómetros. Y eso nos permite saber desde el último rincón de nuestro país qué es lo que está pasando en la sociedad. Así que eso, agradecerles nuevamente esta posibilidad de participar, de ser parte, de sentirnos parte de esta red, sentirnos escuchados por el resto de los parlamentos del mundo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. That's really great to hear from you, and you raise so many interesting points there, and particularly the question about libraries being open to the public, and picking up on the point that Ellie was talking about around the impact of civil society, and the relationship between our libraries and wider society, wider civil society, the expertise and the reputation that we have for authority and impartiality, and what that can do beyond the walls of the Parliament building. Really very interesting points. If I can turn now to Joanna, and how do those things relate to your experience in Canada?
Sure, thanks, Martin. Thanks for having me on the panel. I think Ellie and Alejandro have covered a lot of ground, but I'll give you some maybe examples of how things play out in Canada in two areas. I wanted to just go back quickly to Juliana's point about denying service, and Ellie hit the nail on the head with I think the policy is the best advice. I wanted to just give you a couple of examples for us. It's certainly nonpartisan responses, so we do not answer partisan requests. Sometimes that can be a little tricky, as you know, so we do have conversations with parliamentarians regarding that. The other most common is, as Ellie mentioned, capacity of the team. So if it's requiring very detailed data manipulation and data gathering, there is a point where we do say no, and that is part of the policy. The third area is related to the impartiality, and it's something that we've seen. I think we've always had these requests, and they're increasing more lately, is the library as a backdrop. So we have many beautiful spaces and branches in Parliament, and there's often requests from parliamentarians to use those as the setting for a partisan interview, or their photo that they're going to put on social media, or an exhibition that they would like to have to showcase something that is a partisan point of view. So we had to actually develop a sub-policy that was very clear on use of space to manage that increase in requests. But I do think the use of space question is really interesting. And it really came out, Edward, in your survey about sources. If we're moving to a predominance in digital sources, what do these physical spaces mean to parliamentarians and to our citizenry? They do, if they're older buildings or newer buildings. In Canada, certainly, we have a very prestigious heritage building. If you've had the chance to visit it, it's renowned across the country as a building architecturally. So that carries just a really exciting profile with it as a space. So we're going to keep it. It is closed for the next 10 years while Parliament is being renovated. So it's a moment for us to stop and reflect and think, what is that space in the long run? Is it a space for impartial discussions? Is it a space for relaxed conversation? Is it a space for information exchange? Do we want to update it with digital technology? Maybe not in that space, maybe in a different space. So thinking through our physical spaces is really top of mind for us right now. And then linking to Alejandro's point about the public, we don't have, most of our services are not, research services are not available to the public. Our spaces are not open to the public as research library spaces. We do provide access through tours, through open doors events that happen once a year. We're increasing that view and connection to Canadians. But I think the biggest, and I don't know if this is unique in Canada, but in the 90s, the Parliament asked the library to take on the role of their public education space. So the library runs all of the tours of Parliament. We run an education program for teachers. We run the visits to the library. We run an information service, 1-800-Parliament. So we've sort of taken it in an information direction where basic information about Parliament as a whole, not necessarily a research service on topics, is something that we provide to the public. The last little, I don't know if you can hear it, there's a siren going by. The last little point I wanted to make was the point about knowing our clients and the difficulty, the hesitation we may have in inserting ourselves in their busy day. We have struggled with this over the years. We've done a couple of major deep dives into focus groups, surveys. Probably every 10 years we do such a look. But I think the other piece that's really important is to use smartly use and set up the data that we gather from our interactions with parliamentarians. So who is asking what? What are the topics? How can we use those statistics to glean what we think may be the services that are needed? It made a huge impact on our casework information that we give to parliamentarians. It sparked us giving a whole series on casework. I don't know about you, but there's a lot of parliamentarians asking us to do fact checking on their ChatGPT research that they pulled together, or from what have you, AI programs. So we don't necessarily need to ask them about that. We can see that increase happening in the requests we're getting. So I think that finding other ways to understand what they want is important. I think the people that I'm really curious about are the ones who don't use our services, and how do we actually connect with them? So any hints you have, send them along if you found ways to reach out to those groups. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Joanna. I'm afraid we have come to the end of our time now, so there isn't time to ask the panel any more questions, which is a great shame, because I think we were getting into lots of really interesting questions there, which I would love to explore in much more depth with all of you at another time. But I'm afraid we do have to draw it to a close there. We will be posting a link in the chat to a feedback form, which we'd be very grateful if you could all fill in. We're hoping to run further seminars, webinars in the future. So it would be really helpful for us to get a sense from you about the topics that you would like to see in those future events. So please do fill in that feedback form if you can. I'd like to thank all of our participants. Huge thanks to Edward for giving his presentation twice today. It was just as interesting the second time round. And a huge thanks also to all of our panelists, Alejandro, Joanna and Ellie. Your observations were really interesting, and as I say, I felt really just got us started, and I think we were only just scratching the surface of the things that we could talk about. So I'm incredibly grateful to all of you. Thank you very, very much. And also huge thanks to the IPU and Andy Richardson for organising everything and arranging the translation, which was fantastic in terms of increasing our accessibility to and widening the audience for this really interesting session. So thank you all very much. Goodbye, and I hope to see a lot of you at various events in the future. Thank you all.